computer. So React is just a front-end library or a framework. It's really just a library, but it works in a very unique way. So that's why people call it a framework. Like you can't just plug it in and have it work however. You can't just import files just however you want and all of that. There are a bunch of different front-end libraries or frameworks out there. There's React, there's Vue.js, there's Angular, there's Svelte, there's React Native for mobile development. It seems like every 6 months a brand new front-end framework or library is coming out it just seems like every few months a brand new front-end framework is coming out. But React is the most popular and has been for probably the past 6 years. It's just grown in popularity. Does anybody know who created React?
Didn't Facebook create
Facebook?
it?
Yep, Facebook created it. And that's why it's kind of so popular, is because they've got the backing of the behemoths at Facebook, just constantly updating it and just keeping it relevant. So where does React fit into the full stack development with regards to Django? So you should be kind of relatively familiar with the model view controller, MVC architecture, or MVC framework. That's mainly geared towards like Rails. However, Django, it's really the MTV, model templates views. So it's MTV for Django, but if you hear MVC, that's what they're talking about, the model view controller. So where React comes into play here is we're completely getting rid of those templates and we're plugging in React in place of those templates. All right. And as you've probably been familiar with npm create or npx create React app, it installs several libraries, but there's really only 3 libraries you need to actually get React to run. And that's the React library, the React DOM library, which provides DOM specific methods that you can use to like inject JavaScript into the DOM, document object model. And also React scripts. You don't necessarily need that to have React to run, but it's highly recommended just because it alleviates a lot of pain of using what is called Webpack and Babel. So I'm just introducing these concepts just because when you go out there and you're working in a legacy code base, you will see Babel and Webpack brought up. And just so you're not completely lost, Babel is just a JavaScript compile that compiles new JavaScript code into older JavaScript code, so any browser can run it. So it just makes it backwards compatible, so any browser can run it. Webpack literally just bundles all of your Java, or essentially all of your assets, JavaScript assets, images, fonts, etc., into a single bundle file. Like you can actually see a bundle file if you inspect in the console, and it looks like just huge, just mess of code. That is what a bundle file is. It just like condenses and bundles all of your assets into pretty much a single runnable file, and that's what's actually running. Here's an example of what a Babel RC file looks like, which is Babel. Just be familiar with what that kind of looks like. And the Webpack, this is a bunch of foreign key. It's like hieroglyphics to me. I don't know what it means. I mean, I kind of do, but just know that this is what a Webpack config file looks like. All right, you should all be pretty familiar how to create a React app, npx create React app. Now, what is the purpose of React? Does anybody know? Like, why React? What does it make our lives easier to do?
To create reusable components.
Exactly. Perfect. Creating reusable components for the front end. So here I'm on Airbnb. If I wanted to create this just in raw JavaScript, or I'm sorry, raw like HTML, down here where it says explore nearby, I'd have to create an HTML tag for each one of these and style it, and hard code Indianapolis, Cincinnati, 6-hour drive, etc. However, with React, which Airbnb is built in, see right here, I've got this little thing. This is a production build of React. These are a single component where the only data that's different in this component, like that, the data that's passed into it as props, perhaps, is the Chicago, like that name, like city name, drive time, and some image. That's the only thing that this component is useful for, is just passing in that data and displaying it here. Same thing down here. These are all probably individual components that are just completely reused. And the only thing that's different is this, maybe that the name and an image. You can also click on here. Anytime you see repeatability on the screen, it's more likely a component. So this huge thing right here, that's probably a single component. And that this big component consists of other smaller components, reusable components. Like this heart button is probably a single component that just has a Boolean value, liked or not liked, or is liked, and it's just literally a Boolean value. If I like it, it changes colors or something. And yeah. So that's what's great about React. And same with these buttons up here. All these buttons are probably just a single button component, but the only thing that's passed in is probably the name of the button, the label, as well as what happens when you click it. So probably a function that clicks when I click price, it might pop up something different. So that's all that function, or that's all that these buttons are used for. Questions? Awesome. So here's just does somebody have a question?
So there's a component for pretty much everything?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So here's an example of an old Airbnb page. So here's an example of like a date component, or I'm sorry, a button component, just component 1, component 2, component 3. And if we dive deeper into component 3, or here, yeah, see these are all component 1, all component 2, all component 3. And if we dive into component 3 a little bit deeper, component 3 is the parent component, and it consists of multiple child components, maybe even grandchild components. Again, props is data that's passed into a component, where state is an object that stores data that is local to that component. So example, props is being passed down to each individual component. Here's just a visual example, which we've kind of gone through already. Again, we kind of cover there's 2 types of components, class-based components and functional-based components. Functional-based components is the way of the future. You'll see it in these lectures. You'll see class-based components in these lectures, but just know going forward when you're writing components, they should when you're actually in your job, you'll be writing functional-based components. So components are unique. A component has a life cycle to it. When a component initially renders to the screen, or when it mounts to the screen, that's called its mounting. Whenever a component updates, such as some data changes, the component will update. And also when a component gets removed from the document object model, or it gets removed from the screen, it gets unmounted. And different actions can perform during different life cycle, during its life cycle.
Well, question about that, Tom.
Yep.
When you saying different components to do different things, are you talking about asynchronous updating, or is that where you're going at?
Yeah, so maybe a component tries to mount to the DOM before data is actually there inside of the component to actually render it. So it might break, or that data might not show up right away. Or maybe you need a function, maybe that component needs a function to run right when it's mounted, but that function isn't passed into that component quite yet. So it hasn't actually gotten to that component. So that will so the component will try to run a function that's not there yet. So it'll run into some issues. And that's where component life cycles has specific methods that allow you to execute certain code at a certain time in a component's lifecycle. And we're going to get all into this later. I'm just going to introduce this stuff to you. Don't worry about it. So lifecycle methods. So in class-based components, they have very specific lifecycle methods that execute at certain points in a component's lifecycle. So these are specific to class-based components. So class-based components have a lifecycle method called component did mount, should component update, component did update, and component will unmount. So those are lifecycle methods specific to class-based components. But again, we're moving away from that, and we're going to be working in purely functional-based components. But just be aware that these are lifecycle methods. They're already predefined. They already exist in React, and you can use them at your discretion. So when you see them in today's challenges, don't be like, what the hell is this component did update or component did mount function? So it's pretty much when the component did mount, execute this function. So yeah. So I scraped this from React's documentation. Here is exactly what is executed in a class-based component during a component's lifecycle. So when a component first initially mounts, it runs through the constructor. Remember, a constructor in a class is just like the under init. And then it runs that render method, and then it runs the component did mount method. Updating, it runs the should component update, which returns a Boolean value, true or false, then render, then the component did update lifecycle method. Then unmounting, it just component will unmount. Now there are other lifecycle methods, but they're not as common as these. And don't worry if you don't understand what these are, because we're rarely going to be touching on these, because again, the future is functional-based components. So what happens? So we're moving from class-based components to functional-based components, but we still need to have some method or methods or functions that take place of these lifecycle methods. And that's where the use effect hook comes in. So you'll see the use effect hook, and the use effect hook takes place of all of these. And you'll get familiar with the use effect hook in later lectures, but I just want to kind of introduce to you kind of what it is. It takes place of all these lifecycle methods. Questions? I know I kind of just threw a lot out there. But I know in a challenge today, you'll see a component did mount in there. So I just don't want you to be totally lost as to what that actually is. It's a lifecycle method. All right. Also, Instagram is also built using React. Instagram is owned by Facebook, so it's just natural for them to incorporate. So each one of these images is a single component. So yeah, I don't know if anybody belongs to Nomad list, but yeah. I don't have Instagram, so I can't invest. I can't go into it a whole lot, but
you're not missing much.
I know. Yeah, I know. All right.
I agree with Jack.
So let's jump into actual today's lecture. And so today what we're going to talk about manipulating state and components, conditional rendering based on state, using props, and something that's called destructuring, which you'll be using, or you could use. It's an option to use, but it just kind of makes your code a little cleaner. So in this lesson, we're going to build this MuteButton challenge together. So go ahead and fork this over. Feel free to follow along. If you don't want to follow along, that's okay. Just this video will be out there. So I'm gonna fork this MuteButton over, and we're gonna go ahead and create a mute button that just toggles like the, I don't know, what is it called? Like, you know, like the mute, unmute image So we're just going to toggle that. It's going to be relatively straightforward, but yeah, just feel free to follow along. So I'm forking this over to my personal GitHub, and I'm going to clone it down, do npx create React app, mute button, and we'll go from there. So here we go. Right there. So I'm going to come over here and clone this down.
Is this separate from the curriculum?
I'm going to git clone, mute button, cd into mute button, clear, list everything out. So inside of mute button, it only has two things. Got
Tom, the mute button
SVGs
kind of hiding. You have
of
to
a
click the-
mute image as well as an unmute image, I guess. And all we're going to do is create a little simple React app. When I click it, it mutes it. When I click it, it unmutes just the image. It doesn't actually mute anything. So, I created, or I cloned that down. So next, what I'm going to do is create a new React application. npx create React app. I'm just going to call it mute for right now. And feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Or I should say, what questions do you have right now?
Is there a reason that we would want to use npm like install React, like do it like globally to like speed up the install of this? Like I know you're introducing potential like delayed dependency issue, but would it be worthwhile maybe for this initial phase?
Done.
Hey, Tom,
Can
Can you hear us, Tom?
I think his headset's not working.
All right, great.
We're all alone here.
So I'm going to clear it. I'll list everything out. I'm going to
Yeah,
open
headset's not
a
working.
new VS Code window.
Say what?
All right. So I've got these icons, these
Don't swipe them
SVG.
out.
Don't worry about that. And I've got my mute button, my mute.
Shit, how do we get this dead?
React
Maybe
app.
he muted
I'm going to
us.
CD into mute.
He muted
Oh,
us.
John, do you have a question?
Yes.
can you hear me, Tom?
Can anybody hear me?
No.
We can hear you, well, you can't hear us.
We hear you, Tom.
We can hear
can't
you.
us.
Testing.
We can't hear you.
Testing still. Can you guys hear me now?
Was this?
How long was I not
Can you hear
talking
us?
for?
This
We can hear you with no problem. You can't hear us.
Oh, you guys could hear me, but I couldn't hear you.
this
Yeah.
part of the mute lecture?
All right, cool. All right, yeah. When I was pressing with the mute buttons, I must have actually muted myself. Sorry. Okay, did somebody have any
And this
questions?
Goes back several minutes.
Yeah.
Back,
who
back
wants
to where
first one?
locating the link to fork this is in the middle of the text. I think some missed that.
Yep, sorry. So yes, in today's lecture material and curriculum, Tuesday, July 20th, if I scroll down into under lesson, we're going to walk through this challenge called mute button together. Click over here. So we've got a bunch of forks already, and fork that over to your personal GitHub. Sorry about that.
It is all good. Question. So we're using npx versus npm here when we're doing a create React app. Would it be worthwhile in the interest of speed, given the fact that we're going to be doing like multiple React apps in a day, to like install it like using npm install like -- global so that it's faster in risk like some of the dependency issues, or should we really just only do npx to keep everything up to date?
Yeah, I'm actually, I don't remember off the top of my head what npx is like specifically. It's like a wrapper around npm, right? And
it's like grabbing it fresh every time. It never like tries to cache locally, and so it's like always the most current from the MP3.
Yeah, I mean that's up to you. I personally just do npx create React app, and I just use 90 or almost 100% of the time I use npm.
I think I tried to do npm create rect app yesterday on accident, and I got an error. So, have you tried it? Is it even possible, Jack?
You need to like change the syntax. It's like npm install create react. It gets weird. I looked it up just because I was interested, trying to speed up the create react app. It's what I do while it installs, is figure out ways to make it. I'm not.
All right. Any other questions? Sorry about that. I just don't like hearing you all talk.
It was very
point
fitting
out-
that it happened in the mute button lecture.
I just want to say the fact we're doing a mute exercise and you click the mute button. I thought this was pretty funny.
Oh, geez. Yep, that would happen. All right. All right. So I apologize for the mute issues when running the mute button lecture. So I've navigated into my mute React app. I'm inside the package.json file. I'm going to npm start and have it run, and then we'll go ahead and where is it going there for? And then we'll actually build this out. All right. I know in the materials it says I'll go ahead and build this out using functional based components, and if there's time, I'll go back and refactor it using class based components. All right. So we're in our app called Mute, and is it running? Yep. All right. So the first thing we'll have to do, let's go ahead and move these icons into our source directory. Because remember, we only have access to assets within our source directory. That's why all our CSS is in there and our icons as well. So I'm going to delete everything except for the initial div inside the app. And I'm just going to create, let's go ahead and just create a button and click me. Or I'll say, is this muted? And I come over here. I've got this, is this muted? Ugly button. I'm going to go into my app CS, and just at the very top level where this class name is app, I'm just going to add some margin top. I'm going to add, I don't know, let's do 25%. And I'm going to go ahead. Oh, there we go. That's too high. Let's do 15.
10 EM is solid.
What's that, Jack?
10 like EM is also pretty solid.
Oh, okay. 10 EM works as well, or you can do 100 pixels. I just wanted to give us a buffer just so it's in the middle of the screen. And I guess I'll zoom in too. Why not? All right. So is this muted? I'm going to create, what kind of event listener can I create? So when I click this, it executes.
The on click one.
Yep. Let's go ahead and create an on click. Oh. Now I'm just going to do an anonymous function right here. I'm just going to console log, again, click, just to make sure it works. So I'm going to open up there. So I created this on click event handler that has an anonymous function that when called, when I click it, console logs clicked. So if I refresh that, there we go, it's working. But now I want to be able to store like a toggle is this muted? Yes or no. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that logo because I don't need it. And I'm going to store that in my state. So I'm going to say const, and I'm going to use the useState hook is muted. And that's going to be a Boolean value. And I need to set is muted. equals use state hook, and the initial value is false. So up here, I'm going to have to import use state from React like so. Give it some buffer. And I'm going to just console log is muted question mark right here. And I'm going to actually just log is muted. So if I refresh that, is muted is false. So inside of this console log, I want to create a function that toggles true or false, on and off, yes, no type of thing. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a function called, let's go, I'm up here. I'm going to const toggle mute. And this toggle mute function is literally going to set is muted. How should we do this? Should we say like if is muted is true, set is muted to false, else set is muted to true? I can go ahead, Jack.
Could you do something like set is muted, is exclamation point is muted, or
Yep, exactly.
just like invert it?
So I can do it this way, but we're efficient engineers now, software developers. So I can just say set is muted to the opposite of is muted. And now I want to pass this toggle mute in place of this anonymous console log clicked, like so. So if I go ahead and refresh this, I've got is muted is false, but when I click it, is muted is true, false, true, false. Awesome. So we've got that working. Let's go ahead and move this into this button into its own component. So I'm going to, in my source directory, I'm going to create a components directory. And inside of there, I'm going to create a buttons directory. And inside of there, I'm going to create a mute button.js component. So again, inside my buttons, maybe I'll have a bunch of different types of buttons, maybe styled a little bit differently, but generally speaking, you might only have like one button or maybe a couple of buttons in your application that takes in different props that allows it to be styled differently and all that. But this mute button component, let's do RCS. Let's create a React stateless component. And let's go ahead and pass this. Let's accept some props. And let's pass this is muted button into the mute button component. So what I'm going to do is invoke the mute button. So mute button, and watch when I click like to auto complete it, it's going to automatically import it at the very top. Very easy like that. So I'm going to pass this is muted as a prop into my is muted button or mute button component. So let's just go ahead and display that button again. Is this muted? And I'm just going to console log the props of the mute button. Look down here, it says, hey, compile with warning line 8. Toggle mute is assigned a value but never used. That means I'm never calling this. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And so I've got is muted being console logged on line 12. So right there. And I'm also displaying the props on line 4 of the mute button. And this is the prop that's being passed in. All right. But I think Ankur showed you this during stand down. I'm going to also pass in the toggle mute button as a property. Toggle mute button equals toggle mute. So now, this toggle mute button is responsible for changing the state of the app component, but I'm passing that toggle mute function down to its child component inside of the mute button component. So if I refresh that, notice how now I've got 2 values inside of my props. I've got is muted and toggle mute. And you can kind of see what toggle mute does. All right. So I've got, what questions do you have? About where we're passing the data. All right. So again, I'm passing the is muted state value in the app.js component down as a property on the mute button component. So now I have access to the is muted within the mute button component. And I'm also passing down the toggle mute function, which is responsible for changing the state of the app component. I'm also passing that down as a property or as a prop to the mute button. So now I'll have access to this toggle mute within the mute button component. So on here, I can also just do it, give it an on click and call props dot toggle, was it toggle mute? So now when I do props dot toggle mute, it should update this state right here. Or it should update this state, but then also console log, right? This is muted question mark. So if I refresh that, so initially is muted is false on line 12 of my app component, and my props is muted is also false inside of my mute button because I'm just passing that down. But when I click, is this muted? I click that button, comes up here, invokes the toggle mute, sets the is muted to now true, which then re-renders, updates, or re-renders or calls or console logs is muted, which is now true. And now also is muted is passed into the mute button, which is now also true. So in here, let's see what we can do. Maybe I wanted to render something, do some conditional rendering in here to say, like, when I click this button, when it's muted, do something. When it's not muted, or when it's muted, display something. When it's not muted, display something else. So in here, I can say, again, this is just like a normal function. If props dot is muted, if that's true, I can return this div, this button right here. Let's format and just say, so if that's is muted is true, say off or on. So if is muted is true, so that means it's off. Else I don't even need an else because it's just going to render that. Else on. So again, I just have a simple if statement, but a function that has two return statements. They're not really two returns. Let's actually just kind of show you what it looks like. So it's on, off. So what's happening is this button has a toggle mute, and so does this button. When it first renders, is muted as false. So is muted as false comes into here. If is props is muted, if that's true, render this to the screen, else it's going to render this. So it's rendering on right now. But when I click that, is muted turns to true. So is muted is now true. Is muted true. Pass that true value to is muted, comes into here. If props.isMuted is true, which it is now we're return this that displays an off, a button with off. What questions do you have about the conditional rendering? I'm going to continue to refactor this to optimize it.
Is the like passing of the toggle mute function down into a child component like a pretty common thing? Is that like doing it?
Yep, it's very common. It's even common that it's passed down to grandchild or great grandchildren. So it can, like, maybe a great grandchild component can change.
Is the one that finally invokes it?
Yep. But there are ways to decouple this and like move these functions and state to other parts of the program. So it's easier to pass, because right now we have to pass stuff down and pass stuff up. But instead, maybe there's a method where we can, or there's a way we can just store all our state somewhere else and just plug in that state to anywhere inside of our application. Cool. Yep. All right. So now let's go ahead and instead of displaying a button, let's go ahead and bring in those images, these icon images. Where do they go? So inside of here, we have this SVG. So inside of this MuteButton, we can do import on icon from, let's see where we go at. Let's go up one level, up another level. So we're up in the app. Let's go into icons. Let's go into on. And now let's pass that down. And let's do the off icon. And off. All right. So we just imported two icons. But now I don't remember how to use images in HTML. Let's see what we can do. So it looks like we have this as an example. So in place of this off, let's insert an image in there. And we're going to have to need a closing tag like so. And inside of this source, instead of a route to an image or external image, we can just use our off icon and we can put that directly in there. And we alt tag off icon. And let's do the same thing. Instead of on, we'll do on icon. On icon. Let's see if this works. All right, cool. So we have a button with an image in it, like so. Awesome. So it's starting to work now. But let's keep on refactoring this, because this is still kind of a lot of code and we can like slim it down even more. So again, we want to try to avoid code repeatability. So notice how, what's the only thing that is different between these two sets of code right here and right here?
The icon.
The icon. So yeah, so maybe we can get rid of, just get rid of all of this and have a button. And let's just do some JSX in here. And we can say like, hey, if props dot is muted, we can do a ternary operator. Display, where we want to display the off image. So is muted. So we can display that off image, off icon, like so. So if I refresh that, code still works. It's a little slimmer. It's a little more efficient. Great. Is there a way we can make it even more slim? Anybody know?
I think earlier you what exclamation point or something like that earlier to see if it's like true or false. If it's one of the other state, it goes to the other.
So in where would I write that code? Like, is there any way I can slim this down even more?
Would we make this like a baby component where it like calls it with is muted?
Well, maybe I can even just go. I'm just doing this off the top of my head right now. Inside of here, I can do some props.is muted. Display that, or on icon. And then instead of the off, I can change that alt tag by doing something like, I don't know if this is, whoop. Can everyone hear me still?
Yep.
Got to check. Oh. All right. So maybe I want to do some string interpolation. And again, I can do something similar to this, is muted. But instead of off, I'll just say off as a string and on as a string. Everything still
Damn,
works.
pretty sick.
And you can kind of check to see inside my root, my app, there's my div, there's my button, and you can see the off icon, the alt is the same. And now you can see that changing in real time. Not too shabby. All right. So let's kind of talk about destructuring a little bit. So notice how I'm using, so let's clean this code up again. Make sure you remove all your console logs because you don't want that in there. But anytime I refer to props.toggleMute, I have to do like props.muted, props.isMuted, props.toggleMute. I don't like that. Maybe there's a way I can extract the toggle mute and is muted from props, this props object, and just assign it a variable called toggle mute and is muted. So I can do that by doing const curly braces because props is an object, and I'm going to extract the values of the keys off of that object. So I'm going to say toggle mute is muted equals props. So I'm extracting the values of toggle mute and is muted from the props objects. And now, anytime I want to reference toggle mute or is muted, I don't need the dot or props dot anymore. So if I come over here, refresh that, everything is still working. That just makes it easier if you're calling is muted a bunch of times in your application, or if you're calling a property a bunch of times in your application. That way you can you don't have to do props dot or this dot props dot. What questions do you have about destructuring?
I thought normally the second value was supposed to be a setter function.
So that's when you specifically from the use state hook function. So that's explicit from the use state hook function. This is just called destructuring. And in here, we're doing destructuring, but we're destructuring from the return values of the use state hook. So this is another form of destructuring. But this is, you'll see this a lot, destructuring inside of components. I can even take this a step further. I usually don't, or just because it kind of depends on where you go to work as far as best practices, as far as like how they want things to go. But typically this is fine. This is good. You don't need to take it a step further, but you can by, if you know what props are explicitly being passed into your child component, you can literally destructure it directly inside of, or it's being passed in and it's being destructured right away. So if I refresh that, everything's still working. But this is probably the more preferred way just because it's easier. All right. So what questions do you have? All right. So we've got a little time left. Let's go ahead and refactor this to use class-based. I'm sorry, that's a functional-based component. Let's go ahead. And personally, I like to use fat arrow functions for my functional components. I just get used to writing fat arrow functions. All right. So if I wanted to create this as a class-based component, there's a couple of things I need to do. First, I need to declare class app. And remember in Python, in order to inherit from a parent class, you would do like class, something like parent class. Or in JavaScript, in order to inherit from a parent class, we do extends. And we would need to extend from the built-in component class that comes into React. So I'll need to import component up here. I'm just going to comment this out for right now. All right. So inside of our component, our class-based app component, I need to declare state. Where in functional-based components, we declare state like this. But where in class-based components, we need to declare state 90% of the time like this. Just do state at the top equals something and is muted false. Oh. So again, state is a reserved keyword. So state equals is muted. And if you wanted to add more things to the state, like name, Tom or whatever, you can do that. You can just keep on adding things to the state's local or the local state. But one thing that all class-based components come with at the very end is a render method. And that render method returns some JSX. So in here, I can copy that down into here. There we go. All right, so pretty much I've got the is muted, but how do I reference is muted in a class? How do you reference a instance variable within a class in Python?
You use the self key.
Yep. So whenever you're, just remember, this is just like a class, just like a Python class or a Python object, except it's in JavaScript. And instead of using the self keyword, we use in JavaScript the this keyword. So this is muted. It would actually be this dot state is muted, like so. So I'm doing this state dot is muted is false. Same thing with toggle mute. I need to create a function in a class. And the way we create functions within a class, we don't declare it here, toggle mute, or it's not that we don't declare here. We don't declare it using a const, or we don't call it a variable. We just declare it like so. We don't actually have to add a const to it. So toggle mute. So this toggle mute function, very similar to this toggle mute, except we don't have a setter method that comes with the use state hook. Since it's a class-based component, it has already a built-in method that comes with the component class called this.setState. And that set state takes in the new state. So it takes in an object because state is an object, is muted, and the new value of is muted. We want to toggle it, so we want it to be the opposite of the current value. This.state.is muted. And so down here, we're going to have to reference this dot toggle mute because this is the class. So we have to reference this toggle mute instance and make sure it belongs to this app instance. And so if I come over here, everything still works. That means my app.js is still working. But now let's go ahead and refactor the mute button to a class-based component. RSC rack. Nope, that's not what I want. React class component. So notice how it automatically imported the component, which I don't need to do that there. I'll need to do that at the very top. So I need to import the component class. So it already gave me the skeleton to it. And the nice thing about using a class-based component is if I, let's go ahead and just render something. Whoop, I've got two default mute buttons. If I just like render like one mute button here, you can never, and again, here's another tidbit of advice that you'll run into inevitably. You'll try to console log something in here, like props or something, and it'll throw an error here because you can't console log anything between the render and the actual class where you're defining it. You can only console log within other functions in a class. So inside of my render is where I'm going to console log. So I'm going to console log props. And what's nice about class-based components is that props are automatically passed into the children. So you don't have to like pass in props like you are here with a functional based component. But in order to reference props, I need to do this dot props. So if I come over here, if I refresh, there we go. I've got props displayed console logging in my or in my class-based component. But just like I did over in my functional based component, I can just put that stuff down here. But again, toggle mute is part of this dot props. So I can run this dot props dot toggle mute. And I can do the same thing for is muted. This dot props is muted because I need to access that. And everything is still working. But let's try to destructure props in a class-based component. And I can do that just right here within my render function. I can do const is muted, toggle mute equals this dot props. And now instead of referencing this dot props every single time, or this dot props dot is muted or this dot props dot toggle mute, I can just reference toggle mute is muted because I'm destructuring it right here. And again, everything should still work fine. All right. What questions do you have? Nothing? All right.